Hello, my dear friends. This is Stefan again. I'm going to read from the book of Breathing Underwater. Breathing Underwater. Breathing Underwater by Richard Rohr. We're doing a meeting on this the next couple of weeks. We're doing a couple of meetings to just talk about and to discuss this book. And I realize not everyone has had a chance to purchase this one yet. So I'm just going to read the first two chapters and a short introduction so that we can all get up to speed and talk about this on our next meeting. So Breathing Underwater, it's a spirituality and the 12-step program. It's a combination of realizing we're all addicted, the insanity, as Bill Wilson would call it, from the 12-step program, which is for Alcoholics Anonymous. And Richard Rohr has taken this concept of the 12 steps and used it to describe spiritual maturity and detaching from our addictions. So I'm just going to let him do the talk, let him do the talking. If you think that my voice is too slow or I'm reading too slow, you can change the speed on your YouTube video to 1.25 or even faster, and you'll be able to listen to me reading this, but then in a faster speed. So it will save you some time. So here we go. It's the introduction of Breathing Underwater with Richard Rohr. So it says, almost 25 years ago, I gave a set of talks in Cincinnati to link the wisdom of the 12-step program with what St. Francis called the marrow of the gospel. I was amazed how obvious and easy a task it was, and I was surprised that this was not equally obvious to everybody involved in either of these fields. So the least I can hope to do here is to make what seems obvious a bit more obvious. 12-steppers sometimes thought that they had left the church for the Wednesday night meetings in the basement, and many upstairs in the sanctuary presumed that their higher concerns were something different from those people with problems down below. The similar messages between the two teachings assure me that they are dealing with a common inspiration from the Holy Spirit and from the same collective unconscious. In fact, I'm still convinced that on the practical transformational level, the gospel message of Jesus and the 12-step message from Bill Wilson are largely the same message, even in some detail, as I will try to show in this book. And I will frequently quote Bill Wilson as the assigned author of the 12-step and the so-called big book of the Alcoholics Anonymous, but I'm aware that there is some doubt as to who exactly wrote what. My original lectures were called Breathing Underwater, a title taken from a little poem by Carol Bielek, which seemed to sum up much of the common message. Then I quote it here in full. Breathing Underwater. I built my house by the sea, not on the sand, mind you, not on the shifting sand. And I built it off rock, a strong house by a strong sea. And we got well acquainted, the sea and I, good neighbors. Not that we spoke much, we met in silences, respectful, keeping our distances, but looking our thoughts across the fence of sand. Always the fence of sand our barrier, always the sand between. And then one day, and I still don't know how it happened, the sea came without warning, without welcome even. Not sudden and swift, but a shifting across the sand like wine. Less like the flow of water than the flow of blood, slow but coming. Slow but flowing like an open wound. And I thought of flight, and I thought of drowning, and I thought of death. And while I thought, the sea crept higher till it reached my door. And I knew then there was neither flight nor death nor drowning. That when the sea comes calling, you stop being neighbors. Well-acquainted, friendly at a distant neighbors. and you give your house for a coral castle, and you learn to breathe underwater. The original cassette recordings continued to move over the years, eventually became CDs, and morphed into a second set of talks called How Do We Breathe Underwater?, done over 15 years later. People continued to encourage me to put some of these ideas into writing form. So with some added growth and experience, here is an attempt. I hope I can offer all of us some underwater breathing lessons for a culture and a church that often appears to be drowning without knowing it. But do not despair. What Ortega Gasset calls the state of mind of the shipwrecked is perhaps a necessary beginning point for all and any salvation from such drowning. Connecting the gospel and the 12 steps. Although in this book I will first look at the trapped individual, I will also try to point out the very similar parallels in institutions, cultures, and nations. As organizational consultant and psychotherapist Anna Wilson Schaff said many years ago, our society itself shows all the signs of classic addiction. I began to wonder whether addiction could be one very helpful metaphor for what the Bible calls traditionally sin. I personally am convinced that it is the case, which might be the first foundational connection between the gospel and the 12-step program. How helpful it is to see sin like addiction and a disease, a very destructive disease, instead of merely something that was culpable, punishable, or made God unhappy. If sin indeed made God unhappy, it was because God desires nothing more than our happiness and wills the healing of our disease. The healing ministry of Jesus should have made this crystal clear. Healing was about all that he did, with much of his teaching illustrating the healings and vice versa. It is rather amazing that it did not remain on top of all the church's agendas. As Carol Bielek says in her poem, we cannot stop the drowning waters of our addictive culture from rising, but we must at least see our reality for what it is. Seek to properly detach from it and build a coral castle and learn to breathe underwater. The New Testament called it salvation or enlightenment, and the 12-step program called it recovery. The trouble is that most Christians push this great liberation off into the next world, and many 12-steppers settle for mere sobriety from a substance instead of real transformation of the self. We've all been the losers as a result, waiting around for enlightenment at gunpoint, death, instead of enjoying God's banquet much earlier in life. The 12-step program parallels, mirrors, and makes practical the same messages that Jesus gave us, but now without as much danger of spiritualizing the message and pushing its effects into a future and metaphorical world. By the 4th century, Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire, which left us needing to agree on its transcendent truth claims. For example, Jesus is God and God is Trinity, Mary was a virgin, etc. Instead of experiencing the very practical steps of human enlightenment, the central message of our own transformation into the divine nature, as 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 4 calls it, bringing about the new creation on this earth, Galatians 6:15. It became theory over practice. We henceforth concentrated on how to worship Jesus as one united empire instead of following Jesus in any practical ways, even though he never once said worship me, but he often said follow me. The emperors, not the popes or bishops, convened the next few councils of the church, and their concerns were usually not the healing of the masses, but the uniting of an empire, and surely not Jesus' clear teaching on non-violence, simplicity of lifestyle, and healing those on the edge, which would have derailed the urgent concerns of an empire, as we see in this day. Our Christian preoccupation with metaphysics and the future became the avoiding of the physical, or the physics itself, and the present. Endless theorizing and the taking of sides, opinions about which we could be right or wrong, trumped and toppled the universally available gift of the divine indwelling, the real incarnation, which still has the power to change the world. As Tertullian, sometimes called the first Western theologian, in 166 AD, said, "Caro salutis cardo." The flesh is the hinge on which salvation swings and the axis on which it hangs. When Christianity loses its material, physical, earthly interests, it has very little to say about how God actually loves the world into wholeness. In endless arguing about the spirit, we too often avoided both body and soul. Now we suffer the consequences of a bodily, addicted, and too often our soulless society, while still arguing the abstractions of theology and liturgy, and paying out an always available Holy Spirit to the very few who meet all the requirements. Going towards the pain. There's no side to take in the 12-step program. It's not a worthiness contest. There's only an absolutely necessary starting point. The experience of powerlessness is where we all must begin. And Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, is honest and humble enough to state this, just as Jesus himself always went where the pain was. Wherever there was human suffering, Jesus was concerned about it now and about its healing now. It is rather amazing and very sad that we pushed it all off into the future, a reward system for those who were worthy, as if any of us are. It is this human pain that we are afraid of. Is it this human pain that we are afraid of? Powerlessness, the state of the shipwrecked, is an experience that we are all an experience where we all share anyway, if we are sincere. But Bill Wilson found we are not very good at that either. He called it denial. It seemed that we're not that free to be honest or even aware, because most of our garbage is buried in the unconscious. So it's absolutely essential that we find a spirituality that reaches to that hidden level. And if not, nothing really changes. It is not necessary bad will or even conscious denial on our parts. We just can't see what we are not forced to see. As Jesus put it, we see the splinter in our brother's or sister's eye and we miss the log in our own. Matthew 7, verse 4 and 5. The whole deceptive game is revealed in that one brilliant line from Jesus. But we seem to need something to force us to deal with that log. For many, if not most people, the only thing strong enough to force them into some experience of addiction, some moral failure, or some falling over which they are powerless. We're all spiritually powerless, however, and not just those physically addicted to a substance, which is why I address this book to everyone. Alcoholics just have their powerlessness visible for all to see. The rest of us disguise it in very different ways and overcompensate for our more hidden and subtle addictions and attachments, especially our addictions to our way of thinking. We all take our own pattern of thinking as normative, logical, and surely true, even when it does not fully compute. We keep doing the same thing over and over again, even if it's not working for us. That is the self-destructive, even demonic nature of all addictions and of the mind in particular. We think we are our thinking, and we even take that thinking as utterly true, which removes us at least 2 steps from reality itself. We really are our own worst enemy, and salvation is primarily from ourselves. It seems humans would sooner die than change or admit that they are mistaken. This thinking mind, with a certain tit-for-tat rationality, made the gospel itself into an achievement contest in which the one with the most willpower wins, even though almost everybody actually loses by the normal criteria. That is how far the ego, read the false self, or in Paul's word, the flesh, will go to promote and protect itself. It would sooner die than change or admit that it's mistaken. It would sooner live in a win-lose world in which most lose than allow God any win-win victory. Grace is always a humiliation for the ego, it seems. At that level, organized religion is no longer good news for most people, but bad news indeed. It sets us up for the massive atheism, agnosticism, hedonism, secularism we now see in almost all formerly Christian countries, and in those who just keep up the externals. I I now have more people tell me that they're recovering Catholics than those in recovery from addiction. I am told that for every person that is joining the church, 3 are leaving. Are these all bad or insincere people? I don't think so. Perhaps we failed to give them the good news they desired, needed, or expected. The vital spiritual experience. On the other hand, the 12-step program often became a program for mere sobriety from a substance and never moved many towards the vital spiritual experience that Bill Wilson deemed absolutely foundational for full recovery. If we can speak of the traditional Christian stages of the spiritual journey as purgation, I don't even know what that means, illumination and union. So those are the 3 stages: purgation, illumination, and then third, union. Too many addicts never seem to get to the 2nd or 3rd stages. Any real spiritual illumination of the self, and even fewer get to the rich life of experience, union with God. In that, they mirror many mainline Christians, I'm sad to say. The 12-step program has too often stayed at the problem-solving level and missed out on the ecstasy itself, the trustful intimacy with God, or what Jesus consistently called the wedding banquet. The world was left with the difficult task of trying to live with even more difficult dry drunks. These are people who do not drink or take drugs anymore, but they drive the rest of us to want to drink by their all and nothing thinking, which distorts and destroys most calm and clear communication. If you think that I'm being unfair, hear Bill Wilson's comment himself in his later years. So this is a thing that Bill Wilson wrote. When AA was quite young, a number of eminent psychologists and doctors made an exhaustive study of a good-sized group of so-called problem drinkers. They finally came up with a conclusion that shocked the AA members of that time. These distinguished men had the nerve to say that most of the alcoholics under investigation were still childish, emotionally sensitive, and grandiose. How we alcoholics did resent that verdict. We would not believe that our adult dreams were often truly childish and considered the rough deal life had given us. We felt it perfectly natural that we were sensitive. As to our grandiose behavior, we insisted that we had been possessed of nothing but a high and legitimate ambition to win the battle of life. So Richard Rohr continues, it's my experience after over 40 years as a priest that we could say the same thing about many well-intentioned Christians and clergy. Their religion has never touched them or healed them at the unconscious level where all the real motivations, hurts, unforgivenesses, anger, wounds, and illusions are stored, hiding and often fully operative. They never went to the inner room where Jesus invited us and where things hid secretly, Matthew 6, verse 6. Christians are usually sincere and well-intentioned people until you get to any real issue of ego, control, power, money, pleasure, and security. Let me repeat that again. Christians are usually sincere and well-intentioned people until you get to any real issue of ego, control, power, money, pleasure, and security. Then they tend to be pretty much like everybody else. We often gave them a bogus version of the gospel, some fast food religion, without any deep transformation of the self. And the result has been the spiritual disaster of Christian countries that tend to be as consumer-oriented, proud, warlike, racist, class-conscious, and addictive as everybody else, and often more so, I'm afraid. People were Catholic, for example, because they were Italian, Spanish, or Irish, not because they did the steps or had any vital spiritual experience that changed their lives. We must be honest here and not defensive. The issues are now too grave and too urgent. Our inability to see our personal failures is paralleled by our inability to see our institutional and national sins too. It is the identical and same pattern of the addictions and denials. Thank God that Pope John Paul II introduced into our vocabulary words like structural sin and institutional evil. It was not even part of the conversation in most of the Christian history up to now, as we exclusively concentrated on personal sin. The three sources of evil were traditionally called the world, the flesh, and the devil. We so concentrated on the flesh that we let the world and the devil get off scot-free. We have our work cut out for us, and the 12-step program made it very clear that it's indeed work and not fast food or cheap grace. Gospel people need to do their honest inner work. Steppers need to do the steps, and they both need to know that they are then eating from the very rich and nutritious marrow of the gospel. 4 assumptions about addiction. I'm writing this book, therefore, with these 4 assumptions. We're all addicts. Human beings are addictive by nature. Addiction is the modern name and honest description of what the Bible traditionally called sin, and medieval Christians called passions or attachments. They both recognized that serious measures or practices were needed to break us out of these illusions and entrapments. In fact, the New Testament calls them, in some cases, exorcisms. They knew that they were dealing with non-rational evil or demons. Stinking thinking is the universal addiction. Substance addictions like alcohol and drugs are merely the most visible form of addiction, but actually we're all addicted to our own habitual way of doing things, and our own defenses, and most especially our patterned way of thinking, or how we process our reality. The very fact that we have to say this shows how much we are blinded inside of it. By definition, you can never see or handle what you are addicted to. It's always hidden and disguised as something else. As Jesus did with the demon at Gerasa, someone must say, "What is your name?" The problem must be correctly named, and the demon can be exorcised. You cannot heal what you do not first acknowledge. The second assumption, all societies are addicted to themselves and create deep codependency on them. There are shared and agreed upon addictions in every culture and every institution. These are often the hardest to heal because they do not look like addictions, because we all have agreed to be compulsive about the same thing and blind to the same problems. The gospel exposes those lies in every culture. The American addiction to oil, war, and empire. The church's addiction to its own absolute exceptionalism. The poor person's addiction to powerlessness and victimhood. The white person's addiction to superiority, and the wealthy person's addiction to entitlement. So the third assumption, some form of alternative consciousness is the only freedom from this self and from cultural lies. If the universal addiction is to our own pattern of thinking, which is invariably dualistic, invariably, what does that mean? Which is I'm sorry. The universal addiction is to our own pattern of thinking, which is invariably dualistic. The primary spiritual path must be some form of contemplation or contemplative practice, once just called prayer. To break down this unhelpful binary system of either or thinking and superiority thinking, prayer is changing your operating system. This was well recognized in step 11 of the 12-step program. When religion does not move people to the mystical or the non-dual level of consciousness, it's more a part of the problem than any solution whatsoever. It solidifies anger and creates enemies, and is almost always exclusively or of the most recent definition of sinner. I'm sorry, I got to do this again. When religion does not move people to the mystical or the non-dual level of consciousness, it's more part of the problem than any solution whatsoever. It solidifies angers and creates enemies, and is almost always exclusionary of the most recent definition of sinner. At this level, it is largely incapable of its supreme task of healing, reconciling, forgiving, and peacemaking. When religion does not give people an inner life or a real prayer life, it is missing its primary vocation. Let me sum up then the foundational ways that I believe Jesus and the 12-step of the AA are saying the same thing, but with very different vocabulary. First of all, we suffer to get well. We suffer to get well. We surrender to win. We die to live, and we give it away to keep it. This counterintuitive wisdom will forever be resisted as true, denied and avoided until it's forced upon us by some reality over which we are powerless. And if we're honest, we are all powerless in the presence of full reality. That's the end of chapter 1. No, it's actually the introduction. So I'm going to make another video with chapter 1 and 2. They're a lot smaller. Actually, they're a little smaller, and might help you to get ready for our next meeting, which is soon. So check out the website. Actually, go to Facebook and type in, search for events on Cosmic Exchange. Cosmic X and then change. Because we're organizing many different events. We're starting with this book because it's very practical and very spiritual at the same time. It will focus on getting well, on getting healed, and getting our sanity back, because we're all addicted to our stinking thinking, as Richard Rohr calls it. Well, he uses the Enneagram as a personality profile, or a tool to kind of pinpoint your personality addictions. I use the DISC personality profile. It does the same thing. We're going to talk about these things in our next gathering. So when he talks about true transformation, I usually talk about transition. We're transitioning from the false self into our true self, which is also very similar. He talks about 3 main areas that we as human operate in, which is the heart, the head, and our hands, or our action, our doing. So he talks about the doing is the gut. You know, when you, in your gut, you know things, you do stuff, you feel things. In your head, you think all these different things and truths. And then in our heart, we dream up stuff. And it's more unconscious. It's more under the surface, where we are usually unaware of what's happening. So he uses the 3 things. I use 4 areas because that's what the DISC profile do, is they talk about heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then we've got the spirit on one end, of course, that could change everything. So the fun about this is we're all in this together, and let's find out a way to get healed. All right.